The year was 1991. It was an era suspended between the analog and the digital, a time before the ubiquitous surveillance of smartphones and GPS tracking, when a person could step off the curb and simply vanish into the vast American landscape. In the quiet, tree-lined town of Oakhaven, Pennsylvania, safety was an assumption, not a calculated risk. Doors were left unlocked until dusk, and children rode bicycles until the streetlights hummed to life. It was against this backdrop of fragile innocence that the darkness found Amy Miller. Amy was 11 years old, possessed of a fierce determination and a smile that seemed to anticipate the punchline of a joke only she heard. It was March, that fickle cusp of spring when the ground was still hard with winter frost, but the air held a deceptive promise of warmth. It was Girl Scout cookie season. For Amy, this was serious business. She had a red radio flyer wagon, its axles squeaking rhythmically on the cracked sidewalks, loaded with boxes of thin mints, samosas and tagalongs. The afternoon of March 14th was overcast, the sky a bruised purple suggesting late snow. Amy's mother, Margaret, had tied a woolen scarf tight around her daughter's neck, a final gesture of maternal protection before Amy set out for her last round of deliveries. Her route was familiar, the 6-block radius surrounding their modest 2-story home, that ending at the cul-de-sac where the manicured lawns of suburbia abruptly surrendered to the dense, sprawling expanse of Beckett's Woods. The timeline, later reconstructed with agonizing precision by detectives, established that Amy was seen by Mrs. Gable at 4:15 p.m., accepting cash for 2 boxes of Deux Sidos. London. She was seen again at 4:35 p.m. by the mailman, who waved as she turned onto Willow Creek Drive, the street dead ending into the woods. And that wave was the last verified sighting of Amy Miller alive. Panic in 1991 was a slow-burning fuse. It didn't arrive with an instant text message. It accumulated in the silence of a kitchen telephone that refused to ring. By 5:30 p.m., dusk was bleeding into night. Margaret Miller stood at the kitchen window, watching the streetlights flicker on, her hands repeatedly wiping non-existent crumbs from the countertop. By 6 p.m., her husband, Thomas, had driven the route twice, his headlights cutting through the gathering gloom, his heart hammering against his ribs with every empty sidewalk. The transition from parental concern to full-blown terror happened at 6:45 p.m. Thomas found the wagon. It was abandoned at the very edge of the cul-de-sac, where the pavement crumbled into the dirt path leading into Beckett's Woods. The wagon was upright, the cookies were stacked neatly. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned leaves, no skid marks. It was as if Amy had simply evaporated into the chilling air, leaving her earthly burdens behind. The Oakhaven Police Department responded with the sluggish disbelief of a force unaccustomed to true malice. Chief Whitman, a man whose biggest headaches were usually teenage vandalism or drunk driving, mobilized his entire 12-man squad. They were joined by neighbors armed with flashlights, their beams cutting chaotic swathes through the oppressive darkness of the woods. They called Amy's name until their voices grew hoarse, a collective mantra against the encroaching silence. But the woods offered nothing back save for the wind rattling the skeletal winter branches. Hunter Detective Roy Sterling. Sterling was a transfer from Philadelphia, a man who wore the weary cynicism of big city homicide like a second skin. He had moved to Oakhaven for the quiet, hoping to escape the sprawling darkness of urban crime. Standing at the edge of Beckett's Woods that first night, inhaling the scent of damp earth and pine needles, he realized the darkness had simply followed him. Sterling knew the statistics. He knew that in child abduction cases, time was not merely an enemy, it was an executioner. The first 48 hours were everything. He immediately established a command post at the Miller home, turning their sanctuary into a frenetic hub of ringing landlines, crackling police radios, buttons, and the thick smell of stale coffee and fear. The initial investigation was a frantic attempt to impose order on chaos. The roadblocks were set up on the county roads leading out of town. Every known sex offender within a 50-mile radius was pulled in for questioning, their alibis scrutinized with unforgiving intensity. They canvassed the neighborhood door to door, waking residents, their faces pale in the porch lights, asking the same terrifying questions. No one had seen a strange car. No one had heard a scream. As days turned into a week, the manic energy of the search began to sour into desperation. The national media descended, their satellite trucks parked on the miller's lawn, broadcasting Margaret and Thomas's tear-streaked pleas to a horrified nation. Oakhaven lost its innocence overnight. Doors were locked double tight, children were kept indoors. The town looked inward, suspicion festering like a disease. The investigation needed a focal point, a vessel for the town's collective rage and fear. And they found it in Arthur Mosley. Mosley was a textbook local pariah, a 40-year-old bachelor living in a dilapidated farmhouse on the far side of Beckett's Woods. He was socially awkward, maintained an unsteady employment history, and possessed a collection of vintage porcelain dolls that local rumor had distorted into something grotesque. Sterling, despite his better judgment, was swept up in the current, and the pressure to produce a suspect was immense. Mosley had no verifiable alibi for the afternoon of March 14th. He claimed he was asleep. The police obtained a search warrant. They tore his farmhouse apart, ripping up floorboards, emptying closets, subjecting his pathetic life to forensic sunlight. They found nothing linking him to Amy. No fiber transfers, no fingerprints on her wagon, no souvenirs. Yet the town was convinced. Mosley was spat on in the grocery store. A brick was thrown through his window. He became the personification of the evil that had touched their community. The intense focus on Mosley burned precious time and resources, creating a tunnel vision that blinded the investigation to other possibilities. Then came the break that shattered everything. 10 days after Amy vanished, a transient truck driver stopped at a rest area along Interstate 80, nearly 200 miles west of Oakhaven. In a ditch overgrown with dormant brambles, near the exit ramp, he spotted something out of place, a flash of bright green cardboard. It was a box of Girl Scout Thin Mints. State troopers secured the scene. The box was unopened, sealed with the original tape. It was slightly weathered from exposure to the elements. When Sterling drove the 4 hours to the location, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. When the forensics team carefully dusted the box, they found a partial thumbprint on the cellophane. It belonged to Amy Miller. The discovery was devastating. It completely dismantled the working theory that Amy was somewhere in Beckett's Woods, or held captive in Arthur Mosley's basement. The location of the box right off a major interstate artery suggested a terrifying alternative. Amy had been taken by someone just passing through. A predator who was a ghost, a phantom on the highway system, but someone who had snatched her from the edge of the woods and was miles away before Thomas Miller had even found the red wagon. The proximity to the interstate meant the suspect pool was no longer the population of Oakhaven. It was potentially millions of people. The perpetrator could be anyone in a sedan, a panel van, or an 18-wheeler who had traversed that specific stretch of Pennsylvania highway on that specific afternoon. The investigation slammed into a brick wall. The leads dried up. The national media, smelling the stagnation, packed up their satellite trucks and moved on to the next tragedy. The volunteers stopped coming to search the woods. The yellow ribbons tied around the old oak trees in town square began to fray and fade in the sun. Detective Sterling remained obsessed. He kept a duplicate of the case file in his home study, the gruesome photos and endless reports spreading across his desk like a cancer. He spent nights staring at maps of the interstate highway system, tracing the veins of asphalt that connected Oakhaven to the rest of the country, imagining a faceless monster disappearing into that vascular flow. For Margaret and Thomas Miller, the agony was absolute. They were trapped in amber, frozen in the moment before their daughter vanished. They kept Amy's room exactly as she had left it, the bed made, the posters of pop stars on the wall, the remaining Girl Scout cookie order forms stacked on her small desk. They existed in a state of horrific suspension, denied even the terrible finality of grief. A year passed. Then, too, the file on Amy Miller grew thicker, filled with dead-end tips, psychic visions, and false sightings from across the country. It shifted from the active file on Chief Whitman's desk to a filing cabinet, and eventually to a cardboard banker's box in the basement evidence room, labeled cold case. Oakhaven tried to heal. New families moved in who didn't know the story. The trees in Beckett's woods grew taller, their canopy thickening, hiding their secrets. But for those who remembered, the town was permanently scarred. And Detective Roy Sterling, though he eventually retired, never truly left the edge of those woods, haunted by the little girl who walked into the tree line and never walked out. The mystery of 1991 seemed destined to remain buried, a dark relic of a different time. 33 years is enough time for a generation to rise and another to begin its slow fade. In Oakhaven, the years had smoothed the sharp edges of the tragedy. The yellow ribbons had long since turned to dust, replaced by fiber-optic cables and high-speed satellite dishes. The town had expanded, new subdivisions clawing further into the surrounding farmland, populated by families for whom the name Amy Miller was merely a cautionary footnote in local history. A ghost story told to ensure children came home before the streetlights flickered on. But places retain memories that people forget. The tectonic plates of the community had shifted, but the fault line remained. In 2024, the physical landscape of Oakhaven was undergoing surgery. The old municipal transit depot, a hulking, soot-stained relic of the industrial age located near the old railway tracks, that was slated for demolition to make way for a modern logistics center. It was a place that had once been the thrumming heart of travel in the county, a cavernous space echoing with bus engines and the shouts of conductors, now reduced to a pigeon-infested ruin awaiting the wrecking ball. The discovery happened on a Tuesday in late October, amidst the deafening roar of excavators tearing at the depot's red brick carcass. A foreman, checking structural integrity in a subterranean storage locker long sealed off from the main terminal, noticed a discrepancy in the foundation wall. Behind a rotted wooden shelving unit, there was a loose flagstone. Behind the stone was a void. The object retrieved from that darkness was anathema to the sunlight it hadn't seen in 3 decades. It was a metal lockbox, heavily corroded, fused shut by rust and time. And the construction crew, sensing something profane in the discovery, stopped work and called the authorities. The Oakhaven Police Department of 2024 bore little resemblance to the force of 1991. It was staffed by officers wearing body cameras, utilizing predictive policing algorithms and DNA databases. Detective Clara Vance was the lead investigator on duty. 30 years old, sharp and unsentimental, she viewed cold cases not as haunted legends but as data failures waiting to be corrected. The lockbox was transported to the sterile environment of the county forensics lab. Under bright LED lights, a technician used an angle grinder to surgically remove the rusted lock. The screech of metal on metal was practically a scream as the lid was pried open. Vance, observing from behind safety glass, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the lab's climate control. The box was packed tight, hermetically sealed against the decades. The first layer was mundane, old bus schedules, yellowed newspaper clippings about trucking regulations from the mid-80s. But beneath that layer lay the true hoard. It was a collection of photographs, irreversibly, not the digital, disposable images of the modern era, but thick, textured photographic paper, some Polaroids, others professionally developed studio prints. The chemical smell of old developer fluid wafted up, pungent and cloying. There were 23 photographs in total. None of them were of Amy Miller. They were portraits of children, boys and girls ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 12. The photos were deeply unsettling in their composition. They weren't candid shots of children playing. They were stiff, formal, almost Victorian in their rigidity. The children were dressed in their Sunday-best clothing styles that spanned from the polyester plaids of the mid-1970s to the neon windbreakers of the late 80s. They were posed in nondescript interior settings, against a plain beige wall, sitting on a velvet armchair, standing next to a heavy curtain. And the horror lay in their eyes. In every single photograph, the child's gaze was vacant, terrified, or drugged. They looked like dolls arranged by a meticulous, unfeeling hand. These were trophies, a curated portfolio of victims harvested over 20 years. The implication hit Vance with the force of a physical blow. The disappearance of Amy Miller in 1991 was not an isolated tragedy. It was the conclusion of a long, silent campaign of predation. The thin mint box found near Interstate 80 back then hadn't just indicated a transient killer, but it marked the perpetrator's exit route after what was likely his final abduction. The lockbox in the depot was his reliquary, hidden in the place that had served as his hunting grounds hub. Vance knew she couldn't work this alone. The data was cold, the context buried in the minds of dying men. She needed a bridge to the past. Roy Sterling was 72 years old, living in a small, smoke-stained apartment 2 towns over. Retirement had not been kind to him. The Miller case sat in his soul like shrapnel he couldn't excise. When Vance arrived at his door with blurred scans of the newfound photographs on a tablet, the old detective seemed to shrink, the color draining from his already pallid face. He recognized the scent of the beast he had chased half a lifetime ago. The partnership between the young, tech-driven detective and the embittered, instinctive retiree was uneasy, forged in the fires of a shared, horrific realization. They set up a war room, digitizing the old 1991 files and cross-referencing them with the new evidence. The investigation entered a phase of agonizing forensic reconstruction. Vance utilized facial recognition software, running the 23 faces against national missing persons databases, adjusting algorithms for decades of aging. It was slow, grueling work. The software struggled with the poor lighting and grainy quality of the older photos. Meanwhile, Sterling dove back into the analog past. He revisited the original case files with a new lens. He realized how blinding the focus on the local recluse, Arthur Mosley, had been. He pored over the forgotten details, the scraps of information deemed irrelevant at the time. He found it in a supplementary report filed by a rookie officer in week 2 of the 1991 search, a notation about a payphone log from a gas station situated near the highway on-ramp, a mile from Beckett's Woods. A call had been placed at 4:45 p.m. on the day Amy vanished minutes after she was last seen. It lasted 30 seconds. In 1991, they couldn't trace it fast enough, and by the time they tried, the trail was cold. Now, with 2024 technology, Vance was able to dig deeper into archival telecommunications records. The number called was defunct, but it had belonged to a dispatch service for an independent long-haul trucking logistics firm that went bankrupt in the mid-90s. And the picture was sharpening. A transient killer, and a trucker, someone who utilized the interstate system as a conveyor belt for abduction, moving into a town, selecting a target, and vanishing back into the artery of the highway, leaving the local police chasing shadows in the woods. But the photographs provided a new hurdle, red herrings born of desperation. The facial recognition software got a hit on one of the older photos, a boy in a striped polo shirt, circa 1978. The match led to a man named Dennis Croft, now in his 50s, living in Ohio. The team mobilized, adrenaline surging. They coordinated with Ohio State Police. Surveillance teams were established. Croft's life was dissected. He was a loner, worked construction, had a record for bar fights. He seemed perfect. The interrogation was intense. Vance and Sterling hammered him for hours. But as the layers were peeled back, the truth was disappointing and grotesque in a different way. But Croft wasn't the boy in the photo. The boy was his cousin who had died in a drowning accident in '79. The photo had been taken by an uncle, a predatory man who had since died, who used to take artistic photos of family members. It was a sickening dead end, a coincidence of biology and perversion that wasted 2 weeks of precious momentum. The failure with Croft nearly broke Sterling again. But it forced them back to the primary evidence, the lockbox and its location. Why the bus depoted. They reasoned the killer wasn't just passing through Oakhaven once. He was habitual. The depot wasn't just a hiding spot, it was part of his ritual. Perhaps he switched modes of transport there, or had layovers. Vance began a deep dive into the employee records of the Transit Authority and the trucking companies that serviced the depot between 1970 and 1991. She was looking for continuity, a name that appeared across the decades, someone whose roots matched the likely geographic origins of the children in the photos, and which they were slowly beginning to pinpoint to towns along the I-80 and I-95 corridors. The breakthrough didn't come from a computer algorithm. It came from Sterling's weary eyes staring at the physical photographs under a magnifying glass late one night. He was looking at one of the mid-80s photos, a portrait of a girl with sad eyes sitting on a vinyl chair. In the deep background of the photo, barely visible in the shadows of the room, was a reflective surface, a mirror or a polished piece of metal. Sterling requested high-resolution scans and digital enhancement of that specific area. When the lab technicians cleaned up the image, magnifying the reflection, a ghostly shape emerged. It wasn't a face. It was a logo on a piece of clothing worn by the person taking the photograph, a stylized eagle with gears in its talons. Sterling recognized it instantly. That it was the company logo for Apex Transcontinental, a major trucking firm that had a significant contract with the Oakhaven depot throughout the 70s and 80s. And the focus narrowed with terrifying precision. They cross-referenced Apex drivers with routes through Oakhaven and the estimated timelines of the abductions based on the children's clothing and photo styles. One name rose to the surface like oil on water: Silas Graves. Graves had been an Apex driver for 25 years. His personnel file, dug out of a dusty warehouse, showed a man who existed in the margins. No family, no fixed address for long periods, just a P.O. box. His routes were perfectly aligned with the geographic spread of the suspected victims. He had been cited numerous times for logbook violations unaccounted for hours during his hauls. He had a regular layover in Oakhaven. Vance ran a current background check. But Silas Graves was alive. He was 81 years old, residing in a state-run assisted living facility in upstate New York, suffering from advanced vascular dementia. The drive to New York felt like a funeral procession. The stakes were agonizing. They had the pattern, they had the likely man, but they needed a confession. They needed to know where the bodies were. They needed to give Margaret and Thomas Miller, now elderly and frail, something to bury. The facility was sterile, smelling of antiseptic and pureed food. Silas Graves sat in a wheelchair by a window, staring at a bird feeder, a husk of a man. His eyes were cloudy, vacant windows into a decaying mind. Vance and Sterling sat across from him. Sterling took the lead, his voice gentle but laced with decades of suppressed rage. He laid the photos on the small table between them and the 23 children. Graves didn't react. His gaze remained fixed on the Finches outside. Sterling changed tactics. He pulled a photograph from the original 1991 file, from the school portrait of Amy Miller, smiling, her hair pulled back in a headband. He placed it directly in Graves's line of sight. A flicker, a momentary contraction of the old man's pupils. His breath hitched in his throat, a dry, rattling sound. Sterling leaned in close. He whispered Amy's name. He asked about the woods. He asked about the thin mints. Graves slowly turned his head from the window. He looked at the photo of Amy, then at the array of other children. A grotesque, lopsided smile slowly spread across his face, revealing yellowed teeth. It was a look of pure, unadulterated recognition, the collector admiring his life's work. He raised a trembling hand and placed a finger on Amy's face. Then, his voice a dry rasp, barely audible, he spoke 2 words. At the last, that the beiste. Then the light faded from his eyes again, the dementia pulling him back into the fog. He slumped in his chair, drooling slightly, unresponsive to any further questions, threats, or pleas. Vance and Sterling left the facility as evening fell, the weight of their victory crushing them. And they had found the monster, but he was beyond the reach of justice. The lockbox was not a clue left for them to find. It was his private altar, hidden away when he realized his physically demanding life on the road and his hunting days were over after 1991. Amy had been his retirement party, the final addition to the collection before he hid it away. The Oakhaven police held a press conference, but they announced that the 1991 disappearance of Amy Miller was officially closed, thus attributing the crime to Silas Graves based on overwhelming circumstantial evidence and the discovery in the depot. But there were no locations given for remains, no closure for 24 families. The Miller family received the news with a devastating quiet acceptance. The final chapter of their nightmare was a blank page. Sterling returned to his small apartment, the silence louder than ever. He sat in his armchair as the news played in the background, staring at a copy of Amy's photo. They knew the who, the how, and the where. But the why remained locked in the decaying brain of a dying man, and the earth refused to give up its stolen children. The darkness had lifted just enough to reveal the extent of the horror, before settling back down heavy and impenetrable forever.